Welcome to Conspiracist.
It's great to be here.
Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating and definitely controversial. It's the phantom time hypothesis.
Yes. The idea, fundamentally, that a chunk of the early Middle Ages, specifically AD 614 to 911, about 300 years...
This didn't happen. That they were essentially fabricated.
That's the core proposition.
Yeah.
And our focus today isn't just on the hypothesis itself, but specifically on the claim that governments or powerful groups have actively concealed evidence related to it.
Right. We're looking at the conspiracy angle within the conspiracy theory, if you will, evaluating the arguments for intentional concealment. And we'll be doing that objectively, focusing strictly on the evidence and the reasoning.
Absolutely. The hypothesis itself suggests medieval elites, perhaps around Otto III and the Holy Roman Empire, might have orchestrated this.
Why, though? What was the supposed game?
Well, the main theory there is about legitimizing Otto's reign, making it seem closer to the big symbolic year, whole 1000 AD. Adding these 297 phantom years would shift the timeline significantly.
Okay. So, 297 missing years, potentially added to make Emperor Otto III seem like he was ruling nearer the millennium change. And the question for us is there evidence someone's hiding the proof?
Exactly. That's the deep dive for today. Where do we start? Often, proponents bring up archaeology.
Okay, let's start there. The argument, as I understand it, is that there's a kind of scarcity. A lack of really solid archaeological evidence that can be definitively dated to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, especially in Western Europe.
Precisely. The idea is, look, if 3 whole centuries actually occurred, shouldn't there be more stuff, more buildings, more artifacts, more widespread material culture that clearly belongs only to that period?
And some go further, right, claiming there isn't a single undisputed finding or contemporary text from that specific window.
That's a strong claim made by some proponents, yes. They might point to, say, Carolingian Renaissance architecture.
Yeah.
Buildings supposedly from this era.
Then what's the issue with them?
The argument is that technologically, artistically, they look quite similar to structures from the 11th century, suspiciously similar, suggesting maybe they are from the 11th century, not the 8th or 9th.
And what about Romanesque architecture?
There's also the point made about late Romanesque architecture. Its apparently sudden appearance and then disappearance during this supposed phantom period is flagged as, well, odd.
It sounds like they're looking for anomalies, things that don't quite fit the expected pattern of gradual development.
That's a fair way to put it. And it extends to written records, too. Chronicles written later, maybe in the 12th or 13th century, that claim to be copies of lost 8th century texts.
They'd argue those aren't truly contemporary evidence.
Correct, because they're copies made centuries later, potentially altered or even wholly invented as part of the fabrication.
So how does mainstream history deal with these points? Is there really a noticeable gap in the archaeological record for Western Europe, then?
Well, mainstream historians and archaeologists would acknowledge that the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, certainly had periods of upheaval, migrations, political fragmentation, economic shifts.
Which could affect what got built and what survived.
Exactly. You might see shifts in building materials, perhaps more reliance on timber in some areas, which obviously doesn't preserve as well as stone. Record-keeping practices also changed. It doesn't necessarily mean the time didn't exist, just that the nature of the evidence is different.
So less monumental stone construction compared to, say, the Romans doesn't automatically equal non-existence.
Not automatically, no. And while the volume of written documents from the period might be less than later centuries, surviving texts, when analyzed using methods like paleography, studying the handwriting, and linguistic analysis.
They still provide evidence supporting the standard timeline.
They do. Scholars use these techniques to date documents and trace developments that seem consistent with the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries being real.
Okay. What about the point regarding large empires? Charlemagne's empire, the Visigoths, Avars, Khazars. The argument is there's surprisingly little archaeological footprint compared to, say, the Roman Empire.
That comparison is tricky. The Roman Empire was unique in its scale, centralization, and its focus on monumental, long-lasting infrastructure. These later kingdoms and empires were structured very differently.
More decentralized, perhaps different priorities.
Right. Charlemagne's empire, while vast, wasn't the same kind of bureaucratic state as Rome. Their material culture reflected different resources, different political realities. And evidence does exist. Settlements, fortifications, burials, artifacts. It might not be as overwhelmingly monumental as Roman ruins, but it's there.
And maybe we just haven't found everything yet, or excavations haven't been as intensive in all areas.
That also plays a role. Archaeology is an ongoing process. What we find depends on where we look and how intensively.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another angle brought up is calendar discrepancies. The Gregorian calendar reform, where they skipped days to correct drift, is sometimes cited.
Yes, the idea being, if Pope Gregor XIII could remove 10 days in 1582 to fix the calendar, could someone earlier have done something much bigger, like adding centuries?
So it's presented as a precedent for large-scale calendar manipulation.
Kind of. The argument suggests that in the early Middle Ages, things were less standardized. Timekeeping wasn't precise, communication was slow. Maybe deliberate falsifications or even just widespread confusion about dates could have happened more easily.
I've heard the analogy of, like, different villages not being sure of the exact year and eventually someone just having to pick one.
That analogy captures the idea of potential local confusion, yes. But scaling that up to a coordinated continent-wide insertion of 300 specific years, that's a huge leap.
How so?
Well, local discrepancies might lead to variations of a few years, maybe even a decade, in very isolated cases. But inserting specific named centuries, complete with rulers, events, and aligning genealogies across different regions, that requires a level of coordinated fabrication and erasure of genuine records that's hard to imagine, even with less precise timekeeping.
It would have to be incredibly thorough to not leave massive contradictions everywhere.
Exactly, and maintain it consistently over centuries.
What about the claim that manipulations happened elsewhere, like altering reigns or generations in some East Asian chronicles? Is that used as a parallel?
That point is sometimes raised, yes. Instances exist where rulers might have adjusted genealogies or reign lengths for political reasons in certain historical traditions.
But is it really comparable?
The scale is vastly different. Those examples are usually localized, often dealing with specific dynasties or mythical periods. Projecting that onto a nearly 3-century fabrication across Europe, involving multiple cultures, languages, and political entities, it's not really a direct parallel in terms of complexity or scope. The mechanisms and motivations required for the phantom time scenario would be on a completely different level.
Right. Okay, let's talk about astronomy. This seems like a major hurdle for the hypothesis. We have records of astronomical events, eclipses, comets from before, during, and after this supposed phantom period.
Yes, and this is a crucial point. Celestial mechanics are predictable. We can calculate precisely when eclipses should have occurred, when certain comets like Halley's Comet should have been visible, planetary conjunctions, and so on.
And historical records from different cultures often note these events.
Correct. We have records from ancient Babylon, China, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, the early Islamic world, when these recorded observations match up with the calculated dates based on the conventional timeline.
It strongly suggests that timeline is correct, because if 300 years were missing, the calculations wouldn't match the observations.
Precisely. An eclipse recorded in, say, 8500 should align with calculations for 8500. If 300 years were later inserted, that observation would suddenly seem completely out of sync with where the planets and moon should have been. The general consistency of these astronomical records across the centuries is powerful evidence against a missing block of time.
But couldn't the proponents argue those records were also faked or misinterpreted? Perhaps as part of the cover-up.
That counterargument is sometimes made, but it dramatically expands the scope of the required conspiracy. Now, it's not just medieval European elites fabricating history.
It would have to involve manipulating ancient Chinese astronomical logs, Byzantine records, Islamic scientific texts.
Exactly. You'd need a conspiracy spanning diverse cultures, languages, geographical regions, and vast stretches of time, all coordinating to falsify or reinterpret astronomical data in a way that perfectly mimics the standard timeline. The level of intricate, sustained, and undetectable coordination required becomes almost astronomically unlikely itself.
Especially given that many of these cultures weren't exactly collaborating closely, and some were even adversaries.
Right. It stretches credulity to think they were all secretly working together on this massive historical fraud centered on Otto III's legitimacy.
Okay, that leads us nicely into evidence from outside Europe. This seems like another major challenge, the rise of Islam, for instance.
Absolutely critical. Islam emerges in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, according to all standard historical accounts, Islamic, Byzantine, Persian, etc.
And its early history, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the Rashidun Caliphs, the Umayyad Caliphate, this all unfolds squarely within that 7th, 8th, 9th century period that's supposed to be phantom.
Correct. There's extensive documentation, textual, archaeological, numismatic coins, artistic charting the rise and expansion of the early Islamic world during precisely these centuries. This history involves interactions with Byzantium, Persia, conquests across North Africa and into Iberia.
Events that seem firmly rooted in that time frame, supported by evidence from multiple independent sources outside the supposed sphere of European manipulation.
Yes. It creates a coherent narrative that aligns with the standard timeline. If those centuries didn't exist in Europe, how do you explain the documented history unfolding concurrently in the Middle East and North Africa?
What about specific examples? You mentioned Iberia, Spain, and Portugal.
Right. The Muslim presence in Iberia begins in the early 8th century. We have archaeological evidence, coins, ceramics, early phases of structures like the Great Mosque of Cordoba that date quite clearly to the 8th and 9th centuries using standard methods.
So, tangible proof of activity during the supposedly non-existent 8th century, right there in Europe, albeit southern Europe.
Exactly. And it's not just isolated finds. We see the development of a distinct Hispano-Islamic art and architectural style over these centuries. You can trace its evolution.
Which implies continuous presence and development, not a sudden appearance after a 300-year gap.
Precisely. You can even see the influences early Islamic art draws on Byzantine and Sasanian Persian traditions, which makes sense for the 7th and 8th centuries. Then, over the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, uniquely Islamic styles emerge and flourish.
Like the geometric patterns, the calligraphy, the horseshoe arches.
All developing within this time frame. This artistic and architectural evolution provides a strong, independent timeline that corroborates the conventional history and contradicts the idea of missing centuries. It's hard to reconcile the vibrant, developing Islamic civilization of the 7th and 9th centuries with a phantom period in neighboring Europe.
Okay, so substantial challenges from astronomy and non-European history. Let's revisit the alleged motivation for this massive fabrication and concealment. Primarily Otto III and the year 1000 AD.
That's the most commonly cited motive within the hypothesis. The idea is that being emperor at the millennium, or very close to it, carried immense symbolic weight. Prestige, legitimacy, perhaps even apocalyptic significance for some.
So by allegedly inserting 297 years, Otto III, who reigned around the actual turn of the millennium, 983 to 402 AD, would appear in historical records to be ruling much closer to this powerful date.
Well, the insertion would supposedly have happened earlier, perhaps orchestrated by Emperor Constantine VII in Byzantium or involving Otto III and Pope Sylvester II later, around 999 AD. The goal, according to the theory, was to place Otto's reign at the manufactured year 1000 AD, anchoring his rule in the Holy Roman Empire to that significant point in a manipulated Christian timeline.
Giving his reign and the empire a kind of fabricated historical and perhaps even divine significance, bolstering support.
That's the suggested logic, strengthening the ideological underpinnings of his rule and the empire's claim to succession from Rome.
But let's talk about the challenges to this concealment aspect. Assuming, just for argument's sake, that someone tried to fabricate time, how feasible would it be to conceal it so completely?
That's where the hypothesis faces immense practical difficulties. Think about the scale. You're not just writing a few fake documents. You'd need to systematically destroy or alter countless pre-existing records across Europe. Chronicles, legal documents, church records, letters, genealogies.
Anything that contradicted the new timeline.
Right. Then you'd have to create a believable, detailed history for the invented 300 years, rulers, wars, bishops, saints, cultural developments, and insert it seamlessly. You'd need to fabricate supporting physical evidence or ensure no contradictory physical evidence survived.
And this wouldn't be a one-time job, would it? It would need ongoing maintenance.
For centuries. You'd need generations of conspirators across different kingdoms, religious institutions, scriptoriums, all meticulously maintaining the lie, suppressing any inconvenient discoveries, ensuring perfect consistency.
What about independent sources? Records from Byzantium, the Islamic world, maybe even Scandinavia or Eastern Europe. How could conspirators in, say, Germany or Rome control records being kept in Baghdad or Constantinople?
That's a massive hurdle. Historical sources aren't monolithic. You have independent accounts, often from rival powers or different cultural spheres. For the concealment to work, all these independent lines of evidence across cultures that weren't communicating seamlessly or necessarily trusted each other would have had to be manipulated or suppressed.
Or they'd all have to coincidentally align with the fabricated European timeline for some reason.
Which seems incredibly improbable. Why would Islamic scholars, meticulously tracking their own history and astronomy, end up with a timeline that perfectly matches a supposed European fabrication? The level of coordination and control required across such diverse and often disconnected societies seems practically impossible.
It sounds less like a conspiracy and more like requiring nigh omnipotent historical puppet masters.
The logistical challenges are staggering. The number of people who would need to be involved, the risk of leaks or inconsistencies emerging over centuries, it makes a successful, long-term concealment incredibly difficult to accept as plausible.
So, if the concealment is so unlikely, and the evidence for the phantom years seems weak when you look outside Western Europe or at astronomy, what are the alternative explanations for the perceived issues, like the patchy archaeological record in the 7th, 9th centuries?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the Dark Ages might simply have been different. Not non-existent, but a period of transition and sometimes instability in Western Europe.
Meaning societal changes led to different kinds of evidence being produced and preserved.
It's exactly. Less centralized state power in some areas compared to Rome, different economic bases, maybe less focus on monumental building and stone, more local or regional variation. Record-keeping might have been less systematic or survived less well due to material decay or later destruction, like during Viking raids or other conflicts.
So the gaps might just reflect the historical reality of the time, not a missing chunk of time itself.
That's the conventional historical understanding, yes. It wasn't necessarily dark everywhere or all the time, but conditions were different from the Roman era or the later High Middle Ages.
And what about dating archaeological finds? Is it always precise enough to definitively say something isn't from the 7th, 9th centuries if it looks slightly later?
That's another important point. Dating methods, even scientific ones like radiocarbon dating, have margins of error. Sometimes an artifact might have a date range that spans, say, the late 9th to early 10th century.
So assigning something definitively to one side or the other of the proposed 911 AD cutoff might be ambiguous in some cases.
It can be. Archaeologists usually rely on a combination of methods: stratigraphy, the layer it was found in; typology, comparing its style to other dated objects; scientific dating, associated coins or inscriptions. Usually a convergence of evidence points to a likely date range, but absolute, pinpoint precision to the exact year isn't always possible.
But these dating uncertainties are usually within decades or maybe a century, right? Not the massive 300-year discrepancy the hypothesis suggests.
Generally, yes. The inherent uncertainties in dating are typically much smaller than the entire period proposed to be phantom. They don't usually support removing 3 whole centuries.
So summing up then, we've looked at the phantom time hypothesis, focusing on the idea that evidence for it was deliberately concealed.
We have. The hypothesis suggests AD 614 to 911 were fabricated, possibly to boost Otto III's millennial credentials.
Arguments for concealment often point to perceived gaps in Western European archaeology for these centuries and the idea that calendars could be manipulated.
Right. But we've seen significant counterarguments. Astronomical records seem to align consistently with the standard timeline across this whole period.
And maybe most critically, the historical and archaeological records from outside Western Europe, particularly the rise and development of the Islamic world, seem to proceed right through these allegedly missing centuries without any indication of a gap.
That continuity, the evolution of Islamic art, science, and political history during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, provides a very strong check against the phantom time idea. It's hard to reconcile.
And the sheer logistics of the concealment itself. Coordinating such a massive, centuries-long deception across diverse cultures seems incredibly implausible.
The scale of the required conspiracy, the need to silence or alter countless independent sources, really pushes the boundaries of feasibility. Alternative explanations, like historical changes affecting record-keeping and building practices, seem more parsimonious.
So while it's a fascinating hypothesis to explore, the idea of a successfully concealed, fabricated 300-year period faces some profound evidential and logical challenges.
It certainly does. The weight of evidence from multiple independent fields, history, archaeology, astronomy, numismatics, art history, strongly favors the conventional timeline.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.